Okay, that'll be coming through here pretty soon. Okay, well, we're beginning, let's see, we're on YouTube. And good evening, everyone. We are beginning with paragraph 64, 5, 6 of 2 essays on analytical psychology. So Nick is going to sort of bring us up to date on where we are in the book so that we know what we're talking about. So go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, so just to provide a little bit of context, this chapter in the book is called The Problem of the Attitude Type. And the chapters which came before this consisted of Jung talking about Adlerian theory as well as Freudian theory and the short-sightedness or shortcomings of each respective theory as it regards the thinker's disposition.
Mm-hmm.
So he's working up to his notions of introversion and extroversion and saying that each man, both Freud and Adler, coined a theory based on their respective attitude, their attitude type.
Yeah.
So I think that more or less brings us up to speed.
And that's their personal attitude type, right? Rather than Jung saying, this is more general and applicable. Freud and Adler had more of the, honestly, projective identity or projection into, rather than the more far-reaching Jungian perspective.
Yeah, I mean, he does make a point at the beginning of the chapter that one needs to have a theory that's superordinate to each theory. And yes, he's certainly making the case that Freud was an extrovert, so he tended more towards the external objects, hence the object relations, and Adler was much more of an introvert, hence the idea of the will to power and the inferiority complex and arrangements.
Right. And I think it's important to talk about this transition in paragraph 64 and 65.
Sure.
Where you want to continue or?
No, I think I've said everything as far as bringing us up to speed. Do you want to start with 64 and 65? Just go ahead and read those.
Yeah. There's a point here that he makes in a footnote. He says, naturally, this does not include the existing types. Further points of difference are age, sex, activity, emotionality, and level of development. My type psychology is based on 4 orienting functions of consciousness: thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And I think what he's basically saying here is that he realized that there were all these theories that either pulled to one side or the other, and he was looking for an all-encompassing theory so that these types, for example, would be represented, both would be represented, and the point being that you have to have a reconciling third. You can't just be pulling forever to one side or the other. You have to have something that's above the fray, and I think that's the point he's getting to. So yeah, let's read those.
I would wholeheartedly agree, because then that's Jung saying, when he makes the qualification of age, race, sex, activity, etc., that the interdependency and the way the 4 psychological functions interrelate within any given individual will drive the navigation of the psychology. But starting with the 4 psychological functions, you can then look at how your interdependent psychology operates. And I think that's his overarching point here, is to drive into the 4 psychological functions as the general, which is then, as you said, Nick, superordinate. It's off the individual into the whole, and then you can come back and drill into how any one of us is particularly has their core psychological functions interdependently operating.
Yeah, I just want to quickly make the point. However, he's not yet here talking about anything to do with functions, but just with the attitudes of introversion and extroversion.
Well, yes, but he does, though, mention the 4 words, intuition, feeling, sensation, and thinking, that then become the 4 psychological functions later.
Yeah.
Okay. But that would be a spoiler alert. So
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously in this book, he's still in the learning phase of his career. So we're learning with him. So I'll start with paragraph 64 and 65, and then we'll go on. Okay, the actual existence of far-reaching type differences, of which I have described 8 groups in the above-mentioned book, has enabled me to conceive the 2 controversial theories of neurosis as manifestations of a type antagonism. So this is what he's saying about Freud and Adler, apparently. That's paragraph 64.
Well, wouldn't it be important to qualify type antagonism would be to not try to drive something into a type, not try to pigeonhole it? Is that?
Well, I mean, he's talking about dualism, duality, the opposites.
It's both intrapsychic antagonism and interpsychic between 2 different parties, and also within one person within their own typology.
Yeah, it's the ego and the self, the exterior life and your interior life. All these opposites are at play. So, Marilyn, the next paragraph is 65, just so you're clear. This discovery brought with it the need to rise above the opposition and to create a theory which should do justice not merely to one or the other side, but to both equally. For this purpose, a critique of both the aforementioned theories is essential. Both are painfully inclined to reduce high-flown ideals, heroic attitudes, nobility of feeling, deep convictions to some banal reality. It applied to such things as these. On no account should they be applied, for both theories are properly therapeutic instruments from the armory of the doctor, whose knife must be sharp and pitiless for excising what is diseased and injurious. This was what Nietzsche wanted with his destructive criticism of ideals, which he held to be morbid overgrowths in the soul of humanity, as indeed they sometimes are. In the hand of a good doctor, of one who really knows the human soul, who, to use Nietzsche's phrase, has a finger for nuances. Both theories, when applied to the really sick part of a soul, are wholesome caustics of great help in dosages measured to the individual case, but harmful and dangerous in the hand that knows not how to measure and weigh. They are critical methods, having, like all criticism, the power to do good when there is something that must be destroyed, dissolved, or reduced, but capable only of harm when there is something to be built. Okay, so that's, anybody want to comment on that?
I think it's super critical that that dangerous in the hand that knows not how to measure and weigh, where in that last portion of that line, he's inferring the alchemy of the patient, of how to deal with the patient and how to measure and weigh. And with Nietzsche's finger for nuances, that's always critical, because at this just drop of a pen, whole gears need to be shifted to whole different perspectives to then continually view the patient congruently to how the patient is actually presenting.
Yeah. And
I think also to supplement that, I think it nests it back in what we're in the context of the book, to say that there's no situation in which the Freudian outlook completely accounts for all the problems, and there's no situation in which the Adlerian outlook accounts for all the problems.
Yes.
Right.
Well said. That's a really good clarification.
right. And Jung is trying to provide an overarching approach that includes both of them. I think that's what we're saying here.
Mhm.
Rather than excluding, rather than saying you're wrong, it's just you're not entirely right either.
Well, yeah, it's almost like Jung is attributing concrete or gravel and peat or gravel and potash and soda and Portland cement to one and water to the other, but together they cure into concrete, which is then a structural, dynamic solid, but it's supportive of things. And Jung is looking for this almost fluid concrete to cure into that also isn't as rigid as, for example, concrete would be.
I think it's also necessary to point out that Jung is certainly critical, but also giving praise to each Freud and Adler, given that he devoted an entire chapter to each leading up to this point.
Right.
Which I think is important to note, that in the context of modernism, he's absolutely not being modernistic. Because modernism dispensed with all history. It was basically throwing the home, the family, the lineage away to, this is all new and we're going to be boring and banal, but we're going to be clear. But Jung is looking to be clear, inclusive of all the ancestral history of his current colleagues, as well as the ones before, that he finds, especially in the 14th century alchemists, to be of merit to contribute and benefit what he's trying to get to.
Right. And so one thing I wanted to mention is a lot of people think that there was this huge conflict between Freud and Jung, and certainly there was enough of a one so that Jung was rejecting in 1913 being the heir apparent to Freud's theory because he didn't think it was complete. But people tend to attribute to that there was a great battle between the two, but I don't think that was true. And if you read Jung's obituary of Freud, it is quite complimentary, and so
I think it's more on Freud's end that things got really nasty. I haven't read this myself, but I've been told that in the compilation of letters exchanged around this time period, that Jung was, while they were splitting, he was certainly amicable, but Freud was just downright nasty with him, apparently.
Yeah, well, that may be true.
I think,
but it was a difficult time. Okay, the period between 1913 and 1945 was a very difficult period for people in Germany and the German part of Switzerland, which might as well have been Germany because they were speaking German, and the only difference was they were behind a border, but otherwise they were culturally the same, more or less.
And I think we can look at Freud and Jung as the anecdote of the protege graduating from the mentor, where it comes to a point where you both look each other in the eye and someone says, well, what are you thinking? And the other one says, I think it's time to start my own firm. So and that what happens then is it's just a negotiation of what happens after that. But I think Freud, in his projective way, kept getting squarely angry, and Jung took it as this is simply what's here, and was actually very complimentary. I mean, to the point of even accolades to Freud in that obit. But so I think it's the, well, what time is it? Well, it's time that I graduated, and then Jung moves on and
Yeah.
creates
Now,
his own thing.
Now, Wendigo here says, my guess is Jung was messing around with Sigmund's lady. And
We know that had to be true,
well,
but that shouldn't.
well, it wasn't Jung messing around with Sigmund's lady. It was Sigmund messing around with Jung's lady, who was Sabine Spielrein. And it's very interesting. The play that I'm going to play Jung in, the role is actually a play on the shadow of Jung. All the things that he was accused of, he gets accused of in this play.
Nice.
Starting with Sabine Spielrein, and which is like in the third or fourth line of the play. And so yes, there were some things going on at that time that, there weren't clear boundaries set. They hadn't really created a profession yet. Wendigo says, oops, I had it backwards, right? Okay.
Well, and in regards to that too, I think that goes to say too that Freud fixated, to use his cool word, on that, and it affected his professionalism and his work, whereas Jung noted it and included it, but as ancillary to the actual psychological work that he was doing. He could make boundaries from the personal to the professional, regardless of the moralistic or not. That Freud was, I will say out loud, less evolved. He got stuck, whereas Jung wasn't interested in getting stuck. He was interested in exploration and discovery.
Right, and Freud was not interested in religion. He was not. He was not a observant Jew, I think, and he thought religion was basically bunkum, and Jung, on the other hand, had been raised in a religious family of multi-generations, and so they butted heads over that too. And but let's carry on. So Beth, would you read paragraph 66?
Both theories may therefore be allowed to pass with no ill consequences, provided that, like medical poisons, they are entrusted to the sure hand of the physician, for it requires an uncommon knowledge of the human psyche to apply these caustics with advantage. One must be capable of distinguishing the pathological and the useless from what is valuable and worth preserving, and that is one of the most difficult things. Anyone who wishes to get a vivid impression of how irresponsibly a psychologizing doctor can falsify his subject through narrow pseudoscientific prejudice should turn to the writings of Moebius, on Nietzsche, or better still, to the various, quote, psychiatric, unquote, writings on the, quote, case, unquote, of Christ. He will not hesitate to cry a, quote, threefold lamentation, unquote, over the patient who meets with such, quote, understanding, end of quote.
Yeah. Okay. Comments there? Okay, moving right along. Here we have anyway the butting of heads over religion a bit, and
well, exactly. I think right there, the butting of heads over religion, basically calling it out as narrow pseudoscientific prejudice, and in that sense, again, camel through the eye of a needle. Well,
yeah, there is one point I want to mention here, which is, okay, I never have had a psychotherapy per se. I had, let's see, 5 marriage counselings when my first marriage was breaking up. But aside from that, I never had a true analysis per se. And yet, I think I came through okay. I mean, I kept my wits about me, even though things were pretty amazingly traumatic in various times of my career. But I did that by reading Jung. And so I think that an intelligent person, if given this material, can apply it to their own life and find their way through without professional help. That isn't to say that most people can do without professional help. I don't know. But what I think there's a continuum between conversation at one end of the spectrum between friends, let's say, or over coffee or whatever, where something is really bothering you or something's very traumatic for you, whatever, and it goes through things like the Tarot, divination, the Kabbalah, various other ways of looking at different issues that come up in life. That's sort of a mid-level, but again, the professional in the Tarot is not delving into your psyche per se. They're simply reading the cards or the leaves or whatever it is, the reading or the Kabbalah, and giving an interpretation which you have to take or leave, and they're not analyzing you per se. And it's when that doesn't help enough, that's when you need a professional who knows how to go into your psyche and pull you out of stuff. Right?
Well, I would agree and disagree. Agree definitely across the board, but then with, for example, they use Nietzsche's words, finger for nuance. I know in my professional readings, to say I'm not getting into their psyche would be completely erroneous, because to not do that would be to be a canned reading, and they don't need to be there. And I'm not presenting myself as anything other than a layman and the founder of Architecture of Well-Being, utilizing tarot and astrology. But at the same time, if I did not get into their psyche, if I did not get into the psychological operations of what's happening, not calling myself a psychologist, but if I didn't, it would be completely out of context, useless, and I would have no basis to request payment. And I mean, I have to say, and I went through the same thing with licensure and architecture, and I was an expert witness there. So I'm not really afraid of the licensure thing. And, but I'm not going to call myself a psychologist. But I think that you bring up a great point with general conversation between friends, divination in general, psychological professionals. It's really shifting focus and redirecting scale between the three. And driving a car, and I don't find sixth gear to be better high in the tack for a torque band than third, depending on what I'm doing. All the gears are required. So I kind of feel like we all move up and down through those, whether we go for professional psychological assistance or not.
I'd like to hear Marilyn's thoughts about this.
Well, one of the big factors in psychology when you're assessing someone, and this is when you have to understand, when a person comes to see a therapist, they're not doing it for a casual conversation. They're doing it because their life is stuck. They're stuck in a way they can't move forward. They're not able to deal with daily, the principles of how do you live your life. They're absolutely in pain. Nobody just walks in, oh, I'm lonely and I want to talk to you. They come in because their life is stuck and they cannot move forward. And what you have to do as a therapist is to know yourself so well that you know if something is bothering you in what the person says, you know that it's about them. It's not about yourself. And that's one of the key issues. So I'll give you an example. And this is a personal example. I belong to a group that does dream work. And there are 5 people in the group, and every one of us is a licensed therapist or retired licensed therapist. And we do our dream work. We've been meeting now once a month for about 20 years.
Wow.
Yes, and it's the
Nice.
same group. It's a very amazing group. So, and what will happen, I'll present a dream. This just happened the other day, and I couldn't see it. I present the dream. And so now I've presented the dream. So it's not in my head, it's out there. And so 5 of us are looking at this dream as if it's on an operating table or something. And then one person looks at it. We do it from a perspective of projective dream work. So everything in the dream is projective. It's all about yourself. And how are you viewing the world? So somebody may be able, so amongst 5 people, one person might get an idea. Because we've been doing this work for so long, we all have done, as I say, we've done our work. But somebody may see it slightly differently and be able to understand the nuances of the dream. And I think that's what he might mean by the fingers of nuance. They'll kind of tease it apart and look at it in such a way that you would, should I tell you what the dream was? Is that interesting or not?
As
long as you're telling your dream, yes.
Oh yeah, it's my dream. So in the dream, there was a child, and I was at the White House. I think I was working there, and the child's head was like a watermelon, and it was sliced the way if you would slice a whole watermelon.
Oh my goodness.
So now I'm the child, I'm working in the White House, I'm the White House, I'm the dreamer, I'm all the different parts. And what does it mean what does it mean when there's a child? And then further in the dream, someone went into the child's body and diced it up. So the whole child's head is diced apart, the body is diced apart. And how do you take that? I don't know if an average person without a lot of training could even understand how to do it. So they said, well, the White House is really you. I couldn't see it. It had to be explained. The White House is you. What part of you is the White House? What does that mean? What is the child? And then the other part of the dream was on the radio or on TV, you'd hear, oh, the child died. But I saw that the child was living when I was in the White House. It takes a huge amount of knowledge and understanding to take a dream like that and twist it apart and figure out what it means. You can't just, it's not just a simple thing. So by looking at it in depth with the help of 5 of us, it came to the quotation of Rumi, where it's broken is where the light comes in. I don't know how somebody could do that on a casual basis. And when you're in your office working with people, you don't know what we'll present. So you don't know, is it going to be complicated? Is it going to be devastating? Is the person on the brink of suicide? So I think it really takes a very trained and skilled person, because you don't know what's going to walk in the door. So I think it takes much more in depth than we're looking at casually. That is my own view.
Well, I agree with you entirely on that. And this is why normally we don't do dream interpretation in this group, because I consider that above my pay grade, and I don't.
I just want to make a comment very quickly.
Yeah, go ahead.
This sentiment has been rattling around, and it's just, if I'm frank, it's irksome to me, because I don't think that in any sense dreams require a specialized knowledge. And we need to always remember that Jung came along in the past 100 years and brought all of this stuff to, well, I guess Freud and then Jung to dreams. But before that, the majority of everybody took their dreams very seriously, and you didn't go see a medical professional if you wanted to understand your dreams. So I think we always need to provide that context, because I know I've heard you, Skip, say, we don't have a medical professional here, and all that's fine and well. Maybe it does require some knowledge, but I also don't think it's not the object of a medical professional per se.
Well, Nick, I agree with you entirely. When you wake up from a dream, you can say, my psyche is trying to tell me X, and go on with your life. That's fine. And dream interpretation was, I guess, sort of in the Jewish tradition, because Nebuchadnezzar had the dream of the handwriting on the wall, and among many other dreams in the Bible. So going back thousands of years, people have been interpreting dreams.
I mean, the oldest written document that we have contains dreams. I mean, the Epic of Gilgamesh features numerous dreams.
Okay.
And which everyday people.
I would insert, I think, in defense of Skip's position, and I understand from a contractual fiduciary liability standpoint, there's 6 of us here in this room, and we could all consider ourselves quasi-fiduciary relationships, except there's been no transaction, except for some donations here and there. So, but Skip's position, it feels, is very important rather than irksome, simply because anyone out there on YouTube could consider themselves a fiduciary-related client by default to Skip. And if he makes any kind of affirmation or suggestion or interpretation that then they take seriously and then they implement, then they come back on him from a liability standpoint. I think that's really what Skip's doing, rather than out of irksome fear or too much liability and overregulation. It's the fact that this is public. It's live streamed on YouTube. And that
I totally
right
get
there
that. That's not what I say as irksome per se, because I completely understand you have to operate with a certain amount of care and thought, do things like this publicly.
Right.
And that's not what I'm saying is irksome.
No,
what I am saying is irksome is the attitude towards dreams, which treats them as something exotic and specialized and not for every person. Because
Well,
Right, so
I
you-
don't
yeah, you don't
think that. I don't think that for a moment. I think dreams are messages from the unconscious, and many of them are completely banal and are very clear in terms of what they mean to us, and we can go on. Right?
And there's no reason to ignore our own sleep. We can do what we do with our own sleep in our own way. I appreciate, Marilyn, you brought up, I think, a bigger picture distinction, the difference between a professional's projection and a professional's understanding of transference in a session. And that's important because they're different.
And I would say none of us in my dream group, none of us is a medical doctor. It's not a medical thing. And it always surprises me that psychology psychiatry is a medical practice, and I don't understand why. Because it's so different from, say, someone who's a surgeon or does other kind of, is an allergist. And then if you're a medical, maybe now because of the drugs that they use.
I was going to say, isn't the ability to prescribe substances, that's where it leans over into the medical profession?
That's what I think. But their field of knowledge seems very different to me. That's very arcane. We don't need to be discussing that now, but that's just my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's fair enough to say, though, Marilyn, that there is mental disease and defect, as there is, you can be born with 2 hearts or something like that. There can be things wrong with you when you're born in your brain, and I think that psychiatrists are trained to find those things and recognize that this is a mental disease and defect. It's not going to be fixed by the talking cure.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Absolutely.
Well, that makes sense too, the distinction between psychopathy and sociopathy. I mean, where sociopaths are typically made by trauma, etc., and environmental considerations, and psychopaths are typically born, is the general understanding. Where then that says there is a different thing that has been birthed, psychopathy different than sociopathy.
Right. So, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, because I am an attorney, I still have my license in the state of New York, and I don't want liability by what I'm doing in this YouTube channel. I have assiduously avoided dream interpretation in this group. Okay, I think
I didn't know that. I'm sorry. I won't do it again. I promise.
no. I mean, I think it's okay if I introduce my own dream and interpret it for you. Okay, but I don't invite people to interpret my dream. And it's fine for you to present a dream, Marilyn. You're a professional. You're a mental health professional anyway, and so that's okay. Within bounds, for you to say something, and by all means, keep us on the straight and narrow, because I don't want to be saying anything in this group that is untrue. about mental health. Okay, not at all. And so if we're doing something that's not appropriate, please say so. But the reason I started doing this was that I came to the conclusion that the Jungian analyst community was keeping a very tight lid on Carl Jung's oeuvre, and I had read a lot of Jung since 1987. I've been reading Jung now, and it has helped me tremendously in my life without ever having a mental health professional work with me.
Well, I'd like to make a comment along the same lines about what you said earlier, Nick. As part of my training, there was a very strong emphasis on understanding people's culture. So if I was working with a Native American, I had to understand their background. So it wasn't my Western or my Jewish way of looking at a dream, but what was a dream in their culture. My way of looking at it was not important. So I had to separate myself. I had to learn about where I live. There are a lot of Hispanic people. So I had to learn about Hispanic people. There were people from many cultures. So for example, when I worked with people who were from the Philippines, and they would actually see ghosts. In the Philippines, that's a very normal thing. It's not considered. So if that was a Western person, say from California, and they were seeing ghosts, I would be very concerned. Maybe there was some psychotic piece there. But if they're from the Philippines and they're seeing ghosts, that's a really strong part of their tradition. So I think it's behooves us to take everything that we're seeing from the perspective of the individual. So for example, with Jung or Freud or any of those people, we have to understand they came from a European background. And it's not exactly what the Catholic priests would do in the early days of California.
Right.
And everything is true. Why are you laughing at me?
Because it's so
you.
true. That's such a contextual truth. I mean, it even, I think, aligns in with Skip's liability piece of, Skip's trying to turn the world on to Carl Jung and provide a resource for them to use at their leisure or full on value level, and understand and navigate their own individuation, but on their own, of their own responsibility, so that his service provided here doesn't receive the no good deed goes unpunished kind of thing. It's
All right, I'd really love a chance to reply to Marilyn here, and then
Okay, Nick,
I'd love
go
to get
ahead.
back to the book, considering we're 45 minutes in and we've gotten through 2 paragraphs.
All right.
But yes, Marilyn, I work in the projective dream work method with a group of people as well. former professors, current ministers, psychotherapists, lay people, and all kinds of people in between that join us for our dream group. And, you know, we're all equals there, and we kind of approach it like we're just friends sitting around a campfire talking about dreams, rather than saying, you know, this is to be treated extremely carefully. And I think that both perspectives are quite true. It's not to say that one should ever treat their dreams flippantly, but I do think that it's easy for I guess it's easy to think like, you know, I need to go to see a Jungian analyst to understand my dreams, and I've got to pay $180 to sit there and talk with somebody, and only they will give me the key to understand this thing that I dreamt.
Mm-hmm.
And that just that's what I was saying is irksome, and I don't want to do anything to encourage that attitude personally. And secondly, yes, I would say transparency is key in working with people from different cultures. I don't have that much experience with that, but I'm thankful that you had that perspective.
Yeah, we have some
couldn't-
comments on YouTube that are worth addressing here, Nick, because one of them is urging you to find a more modern group. So, and
Oh my gosh.
and I very often get accused for
Whatever that means.
being old, and I don't deny that I'm old. I'm 75 years old now, so I'm
Angela, I appreciate it, but
right.
These people are my friends.
Okay, so Angela says, is it ignorant of me to say that I agree with Nick? I am by any means a pro. However, I don't think we need medical professionals. I think it's an antiquated way of thinking in regards to interpreting dreams. No way in heaven or hell can anyone give you a solid answer about what a dream means. And then later she says, you can't solve modern day problems with antiquated techniques, Nick. You need a new group of people to discuss with. Sorry to say, have a good evening, y'all. All the love. Well, okay, thank you.
You know, I would completely agree, but that the antiquated thing is our modern thinking. The shaman would actually empathize with you and then send you out into nature to figure it out for yourself. And, you know, so I agree that we should not ignore or be led to ignore any part of our life that we find valuable, especially the unconscious part. And, you know, it goes back to sovereignty and handing over your power. It's like, you know, like Nick says, I don't want to spend $180 for a session for someone to give me the key. I can go to the Tree of Life and there are 22 keys. You know, I can go to my key ring and there's a janitor level of keys. I mean, there's no reason to hand over your wits, so to speak, to then stop until your appointment. You know, it's like, no, life doesn't work that way. So I agree that is irksome too. And I honestly, even from architecture as an architect, for example, it's about 150 years old. Before that, you were a master builder. You had to do it all. It's only when the differentiation or the watermelon slicing from Maryland happened in the White House that, you know, liability and insurance came in and went, oh, we could fill all of these spaces with money. And so I would agree wholeheartedly. And I appreciate Angela's comment that there's no reason to. The antiquated thing is what we have in modern life. That the non-antiquated is the old.
Just one final thing I want to say here really quickly.
Ahead, Nick.
So on the topic of dreams, because, you know, I do feel like perhaps I've been a bit one-sided here. But, you know, what I've said, I do stand by, but at the same time, I just want to add the notion that there are serious limitations to doing dream work in isolation. You do need the participation with other people.
Yes.
And that's something that's really come to the fore in my group dream work. And there are serious limitations to just being an individual doing that kind of thing. That doesn't mean
I don't not know it. I don't deny it, because the dream comes from what Jung used to call the 2 million year old man. And what he meant by that was that it's actually 3.5 billion years old, and the psyche developed evolutionarily all through all those 3.5 billion years. And it developed a system of imagery to communicate with your consciousness, basically, over those years, long before language was ever developed. And some of the imagery that it uses may be arcane and not recognized by modern people. But nonetheless, if I close my eyes, I'm getting all kinds of messages all the time, okay, in my psyche. I mean, if I close my eyes to go to sleep, I can select from, I don't know, 20 different things that I would dream about that are being presented to me, to my consciousness. And I've gotten
If you're
to the
choosing them, they're not dreams.
Huh?
If you're choosing them, I have to say I don't think that they're dreams. But
Well, I don't know, but very often I get an image like in the control room of a TV studio where there's such and such on this screen, another thing on this screen, and so on. And there are 18 or 20 of those. And I don't know whether they're dreams or not, Nick. All I know is that if I want to, I pick from one, and then I have a dream about that. I pick one. And
It's like lucid dreaming. That's
yeah, in a way it is. It's a kind of lucid dreaming. And I don't know.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. But anyway, what has happened over the 5 years that we've been doing this group is that the Jungian analyst community has come to respect what I'm doing, and have, they have said what I'm doing is important and I should continue on, et cetera, et cetera. So no one has ever really criticized me. I've never had a Jungian analyst criticize what I'm doing on YouTube. So I'm just taking it one week at a time. That's all. Okay, let's go on to read some more here. So 67, paragraph 67. The two theories of neurosis are not universal theories. They are caustic remedies to be applied, as it were, locally. They are destructive and reductive. They say to everything, you are nothing but. They explain to the sufferer that his symptoms come from here and from there and are nothing but this or that. It would be unjust to assert that this reduction is wrong in a given case, but exalted to the status of a general explanation of the healthy psyche as well as the sick, a reductive theory by itself is impossible. For the human psyche, be it sick or healthy, cannot be explained solely by reduction. Eros is certainly always and everywhere present. The urge to power certainly pervades the heights and depths of the psyche. But the psyche is not just the one or the other, nor that, for that matter, both together. It is also what is made and will make it is also what is made and will make out of them. A man is only half understood when we know how everything in him came into being. If that were all, he could just as well have been dead years ago. As a living being, he is not understood, for life does not have only a yesterday, nor is it explained by reducing today to yesterday. Life has also a tomorrow, and today is understood only when we can add to our knowledge of what was yesterday the beginnings of tomorrow. This is true of all life's psychological expressions, even of pathological symptoms. The symptoms of a neurosis are not simply the effects of a long past causes, whether infantile sexuality or the infantile urge to power. They are also attempts at a new synthesis of life, unsuccessful attempts, let it be added in the same breath, yet attempts nevertheless with a core of value and meaning. They are seeds that fail to sprout owing to the inclement conditions of inner and outer nature. Nick, you want to take that one on?
Yeah, sure. Just one comment on the notion of they are also attempts at a new synthesis of life. Unsuccessful attempts, let it be added in the same breath. And it's really interesting because I know that we talked many times about this notion of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis as a form of the dialectic. And Jung elsewhere talks about using the dialectic in the analytic process as well, and it consisting mostly in a process of one of his patients or his analysants being more or less stuck, kind of going through the monotonous process of talking about the same stuff over and over and over and over. And he said that more often than not, the dream will produce the image of where the work is to go, and saying that what the analysant is talking about is the thesis, and then the dream compensates with the antithesis, and the synthesis or the dialectic of the analytic process happens when patient or analyst and analysant then work to synthesize that into this third position, into this new insight, into the step forward. So I think that's really profound. It also ties in this notion of working with dreams. And I have to say, this might be a bit harsh, but I'll say it anyways. It's my feeling that if you don't work with dreams, you're not doing the Jungian thing. You're not really working with your inner images, and you're not really taking it that seriously in terms of personal work.
Yeah. Nick, I think that's well and good. I think Craig Nelson and many other people offer dream groups on YouTube. And
I just want to say that's not a criticism of anybody here. I'm just
yeah,
saying
I understand.
it's wholly important to really making it something that you can do rather than something that you read about.
Right.
Well, and I would add, pardon, Skip, I would add to piggyback right onto what you said, Nick, that to take it forward into Jung's quote unquote tomorrow concept, a wonderful concept I love from Joan Didion is I have lost touch with several people I used to be.
Yeah.
And that's about the phases in the life cycle of the individuation process and of the healing process and of if I even remove the word healing, of just the life process, where, and Alan Watts would follow that up with, you have no responsibility to be who you were even 5 minutes ago,
Right.
And so a matter of Jung bringing in the tomorrow concept here, I think is just as large and dances really well with what you put in there with that, to put them both together.
Yeah, what I am willing to talk about, Nick, is active imagination. Okay, because that's something that I have direct experience with. Dr. Jung's Red Book is basically an active imagination, cover to cover, and it is a form of dream work. There was a time when it frightened me. Okay, I had this possession period in 1993 where I had an anima possession that caused me to do a active imagination that emerged as a novel, and I put it in my drawer because it frightened me. And it was 16 years later when Jung's Red Book was presented, and I said, oh, wait a minute, if the greatest psychiatrists, psychologists of the 20th century can have an experience like this, then it's okay for puny old me to have that experience, right? And so, I do strongly believe in an active imagination, true active imagination, not trying to direct imagination, but letting what comes come. And I'm happy to talk about my experience with respect to that. And if you have such experiences, you're welcome to talk about it too. What I'm what I'm concerned about in dream interpretation, though, is stuff coming up that's really arcane and really old in the psyche. And
You run the exact same risk, however, with active imagination. I don't understand how you can grip one into an ethical or constraint and not the other. But also, I don't.
Because with active imagination, I could have an ethical constraint. In other words, I could examine the spirits, whether they be of God or not. And for the longest time, I thought my novel was not of God, but I finally have established in my own psyche that it is. And so I can make a judgment, a moral judgment about what is in my active imagination that I want to present to the world. But in a dream, you're sort of free floating, and you're letting your unconscious sort of blurt out. And
I would say just the opposite. I mean, this may turn into, a side conversation that might be had elsewhere, might to be had elsewhere, but it really seems like, dreams are the only reliable exponent of the self and the unconscious. I mean, they're produced spontaneously, and they're not subject to colluding your conscious points of view.
And I'm not an expert in dreams.
Well, I would add a third piece to connect you to, and that is the awake dream, or Theosophic Vision, which is archetypally a large vision level shamanic kind of dream that occurs completely consciously. That would be basically a daydream, capital D. And then that would then, fortunately, I think, put a foot on both sides of you, Nick, and Skip, and stand in both, because a Theosophic Vision is not a not real dream. It just occurs during waking hours. So is that, numinous or liminal breaches where the unconscious comes through into consciousness, literally, or et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop right there. But I think the concept of active imagination, Theosophic Vision, and awake dreams, and then nocturnal or nascent while you're sleeping dreams, they're all three of the same family. And I don't know that we can distinguish one is more or less liable than the other. I think when Skip is basically alluding to the automatic writing of the French surrealists, the stream of consciousness, as it were, that's kind of what that book seems to come from, where he's not getting in the way of the numinous experience. It's pouring out and pouring on the page. Whereas then you're saying your dream occurred, and well, you're not getting in the way of the experience. It is what is there that happened. And what's interesting is both happen at the Theosophic Vision.
Yeah, it's so we've sort of gotten off track here, and I want to.
Yeah, let's put a pin in it.
Pull us
back and forward on
I think so.
Right, and it's simply clear. I don't want to be interpreting dreams for anybody else on this channel. Marilyn is an exception because she's a mental health professional, and she can present a dream and knows what it means and can present what it means. But I'm I don't want this to be a dream group. I want it to be something else, right?
Right.
Because there's plenty to talk about in Jung besides dreams, plenty. Okay, let's read paragraph 68. Jordan, do you want to do that? Or
sure, I'll take that one. Paragraph 68. The reader will doubtless ask, what in the world is the value and meaning of a neurosis? This most useless and pestilent curse of humanity. To be neurotic, what good can that do? As much good, possibly, as flies and other pests, which the good Lord created so that man might exercise the useful virtue of patience. however stupid this thought is from the point of view of natural science, it may yet be sensible enough from the point of view of psychology. If we put nervous symptoms, quote unquote, instead of pests, quote unquote, even Nietzsche, a rare one for scorning stupid and banal thoughts, more than once acknowledged how much he owed to his malady. I myself have known more than one person who owed his entire usefulness and reason for existence to a neurosis, which prevented all the worst follies in his life and forced, in italics, forced him to be a mode of living that develops his valuable potentialities. These might have been stifled had not the neurosis, with iron grip, held him to the place where he belonged. There are actually people who have the whole meaning of their life, their true significance in the unconscious, while in the conscious mind is nothing but inveiglement and error, which is veiled. With others, the case is reversed, and here neurosis has a different meaning. In these cases, but not in the former, a thoroughgoing reduction is indicated.
You want to comment on that, Beth, or anybody? So what Jung it says throughout his oeuvre is that neuroses can be the psyche's attempt to heal an illness, an unconscious illness. And so the psyche tries to heal. And in so doing, it presents at the conscious level as a neurosis. I don't know. I have no comment on that.
Well, I'll call attention to the passage of there are actually people who have the whole meaning of their life, their true significance in the unconscious, while in the conscious mind is nothing but inveiglement and error. So what's interesting there is that's making the inference that some people have to simply go with their own unconscious flow to function. Because if they go with anything they decide, think, see, feel, have perspective about inveiglement, they will be veiled and erroneous. They can't do anything but misstep. So it's interesting that this brings about the point of view of your life's work not being able to be expressed in words, but you do it nonetheless. And so you don't need to explain it. It's unconscious. Whereas in those people, if they don't, they're always going to be fraught with error and their own PTSD that's self-created because they're trying to explain all this stuff to other people, when the reality is they just should continue the stoic discipline of the ritual of doing what they do.
And I'm sure I think a lot of people do that. They get into a profession that they detest and stick with it. And they're therefore are miserable. In my case, I always went with the flow, and ultimately that took me out of the logos and into the eros, because I was, thoroughly trained in the logos by the Marines, the law school, and the business school.
Right.
And then I got into actual business in Tokyo, and I discovered that none of that was going to help me one iota.
Mm-hmm.
None of it would help me.
Right.
And my experiences in leading individuals and persuading people to do what I wanted them to do, those things did help. But there was nothing I learned in a classroom in any of those logos-oriented educations that ever helped me in business. Nothing, absolutely nothing. And
I think was the old adage, it takes you 58 years to unlearn the BS that was put in your head in college.
Right.
I mean,
and
and that's about when your career starts.
yeah, I mean, I'll just give an example because I did learn three things in business school, which I can express, but they were not learned in the classroom, and I have used them. Okay, so three things. Number one, when I was applying to the business program, one of my gunnery instructors from the Marines was a year ahead of me in the program. And he was the NROTC instructor at the University of Rochester. And so he was given the opportunity to take this class, and he did. And so he invited me out to lunch before I applied. And I said to him, Jack, why are you doing this? You're a career Marine officer. He was a major at that time. I was a major also, but he was a major, and he was a career Marine officer, and he wasn't going to use anything from business school in his service up through colonel, let's say. And he just looked across the table at me, very serious, and he said, so that now nobody can bullshit me.
Nice.
And he was right, okay, because nobody can BS me about statistics anymore. I can find the errors in an annual report of a Fortune 500 company. I can find the trouble in it within I would say 30 seconds, 60 seconds max. And the secret to that is all you do is look at the footnotes, because that's where they hide the shit they don't want you to know about.
It's nice. It's funny you say that. We used to have a joke in a firm I worked for where two of us were, if I can't find an error in your drawings in 30 seconds, I'll buy you lunch anywhere you want to go.
Yeah.
And
So
we never bought anybody lunch.
So the second thing that I learned was in the first year, I took microeconomics, and we had an essay project, and I worked on this essay and, did a great job on it, I thought, and I got citations, typical lawyer stuff. And so I was really proud of this essay, and I turned it in, and it comes back as a D. And I go, oh my God. It was like my life was ending because I was in this business program and I got a D. And so during the break after that class, I was standing out in the hallway with my D paper and sort of reeling from my reaction to it. And one of my professors, whose name is Cliff Smith, he's still emeritus professor up there many years later, but we were right outside his office. So he said, "What's the matter?" He saw that I was, hurting, and I said, "Well, I got this D, and I have no idea why." And he said, "Give me that." And he grabbed my paper, and he went into his office. I followed him in rather sheepishly, and he sat there. And in about 5 minutes, he started to laugh, and he said, "Well, I see what the problem is." He was a Georgia guy. "I see what the problem is. You answered this like a lawyer, and this isn't this isn't a law essay. This is a microeconomics essay."
Oh, too funny.
and so then he explained costs and benefits to me, which is not something you learn in law school. And of course, if I looked at it in a costs and benefits kind of way, I had no problem with it. And in the microeconomics course, I understood it completely. As soon as he said that to me, boom, I got it. I got the whole course right there. Okay, but I didn't learn that in the classroom. I learned that because of this event. And the third thing was that Cliff was also a professor of finance. And so in the second year, he gave us a really, really tough, nasty exam. And I was in the executive program, so we had older students in the class, and one of them, the oldest one, was a vice president from New York Tel, and he came out of the test. I came out of the test, and I was just chatting in the hall with Cliff about the test, just in a passing way, and the Hawk, which is what we called this man, came out of the test, and he was furious because of how difficult it was, absolutely furious. And he walked up to Cliff and he just chewed him right up one side and down the other for giving this difficult test to these people who have professions and careers, and they're doing this one day a week type thing. And after he slowed down at the end of his rant, Cliff says, "Hey man, if it wasn't tough, it wouldn't be worth anything." And that's the point. In the end, that's the point, that you have to stress yourself to learn something. But I don't remember a damn thing that I learned in classroom in those courses. And the same with law school. I mean, law school basically teaches you how to use the library.
Advanced Dewey Decimal System.
Right.
It's like ads.
Right. But and
Westlaw.
I get to Japan and I'm running this company in Tokyo, and never one time did I have a large enough population to put a statistical regression on it, to put any statistics on it. It had to be seat of the pants. And that's the way my businesses have always been. I've always had to do it based on what I felt, what I figured, not based on any math. Never helped me, not once. None of the logos helped me. So that's the thing. And all right.
Well, actually, to confirm that too. Okay, I took my degree in architecture, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many math courses did I take to complete the architecture program?
I don't know.
The number would be 0.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Because I just took a bunch of CLEP tests. So it was one of those, okay, there's a natural affinity, but let's get rid of this thing that's supposed to be so important. And in the program, let's push that to the side. So it's, again, that, like you said, by the seat of your pants kind of thing. I think these next two paragraphs kind of speak to that, 69 and 70.
You want to carry on?
Shall I just carry on?
Yep.
At this point, the reader may be inclined to grant the possibility that the neurosis has such a meaning in certain cases, while denying it so far-reaching a purposiveness in ordinary everyday cases. What, for instance, could be the value of a neurosis in the above-mentioned case of asthma with its hysterical anxiety states? I admit the value is not so obvious here, especially when the case is considered from the theoretical reductive standpoint, that is, from the shadow side of individual development. The two theories we have been discussing evidently have this much in common. They pitilessly unveil everything that belongs to man's shadow side. They are theories, or more correctly, hypotheses, which explain in what the pathogenic factor consists. They are accordingly concerned not with a man's positive values, but with his negative values, which make themselves so disturbingly conspicuous. Why don't I read the next paragraph, because it goes to define value.
Before you do that, I do want to comment on 69 here, because he mentions asthma. And,
Right.
And I am a lifelong sufferer from asthma. And what my observation is that what he says here is fairly antiquated from a medical point of view. And so when I had asthma as a 2-year-old boy, and probably I did have these kinds of hysterical anxiety states, I would say. I would say I did have. And
'Cause you were drowning, basically.
yeah, I was drowning, and it was quite bad. And fortunately, the Navy just had a solution for that, which was the school solution for asthma at that time was to go live on the desert, to move to Phoenix or the desert of California. And the Navy had a base in Inyokern, Naval Ordnance Testing Center. And so my father got stationed in the Mojave Desert for 3 years. And sure enough, my asthma cured. But and the doctors never understood what caused it in the first place, nor how, other than the fact that it was dry air that cured me. And but later on, medical science learned that asthma is often caused by allergies. And in my case, I have been multiple tested by allergists since I was 25, so for the last 50 years. And one of them, who had 10,000 patients, said I was one of 3 patients that he had tested positive for everything that he had. And so to this day, I still take allergy shots every 2 weeks. I take 2 shots every 2 weeks to cover every item that they test for. And that has kept me going over the years.
And isn't asthma not a weakness? Isn't it a hyperactive immune system, like an overstrength in a way, where your body is responding to absolutely every influence?
Yeah. It's I have a very strong immune system,
right?
Because my body reacts to everything, right?
Right.
And but the funny thing is, if I go to a new locale, like when I was in Vietnam, I sneezed twice in 9 months, sneezed twice, and I wasn't taking allergy shots at that point. And when we moved to Japan, everything was fine, in my adult life. And I didn't have a real problem with asthma in my high school years, even though there was something special called TY asthma, which was a special kind caused by air pollution, basically. And so when we went back to Tokyo, I didn't have a problem the first 4 years, but after 4 years, my body started to react to the allergens in the air in Tokyo. And so when we came back from that is when I started to take allergy shots. And so medical science has come a bit along the way since he wrote this, but so that would be my comment. But all right, go ahead and read the value.
Paragraph 71, a quote unquote value is a possibility for the display of energy. But insofar as a negative value is likewise a possibility for the display of energy, which can be seen most clearly in the notable manifestations of neurotic energy, it too is properly a quote unquote value, but one that brings about useless and harmful manifestations of energy. Energy in itself is neither good nor bad, neither useful nor harmful, but neutral, since everything depends on the form in italics, into which energy passes. Form gives energy its quality. On the other hand, mere form without energy is equally neutral. For the creation of a real value, therefore, both energy and valuable form are needed. In neurosis, psychic energy. In neurosis, psychic energy is present, but undoubtedly, it is there in an inferior and unserviceable form. The two reductive theories act as solvents of this inferior form. They are approved caustic remedies by means of which we obtain free but neutral energy. Now, it has hitherto been supposed that this newly disengaged energy is at the conscious disposal of the patient, so that he can apply it at his pleasure. Since it was thought that the energy is nothing but the instinctual power of sex, people talked of a quote unquote sublimated application of it on the assumption that the patient could, with the help of analysis, canalize sexual energy into a sublimation. In other words, could apply it non-sexually in the practice of an art, perhaps, or in some other good or useful activity. According to this view, it is possible for the patient, from free choice or inclination, to achieve the sublimation of his instinctual forces.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to make a comment here, and I was hoping to say this around 68, but
Okay, go for it.
I'll say it here. I'm thinking of, I think it's somewhere in the symbolic life where Jung is talking about the idea that neurosis is a substitution for the genuine suffering that's really at the back of neurosis.
Mm-hmm.
Funny, I've heard some people talk about Nietzsche kind of as the first depth psychologist. And even though, we're reading about Nietzsche now, and, Jung has had a lot to say, both in agreement and in opposition with Nietzsche, in some sense, like, he really laid the groundwork for this notion of Jung's, which, neurosis is a substitution for real suffering. Because with Nietzsche's idea of the transvaluation of all values, he sought this very, very raw experience of what is truly real, of hyper real, of like, he had this idea that truth is a metaphor, and everything that we talk about in the language that we've agreed upon to talk about it is just a metaphor. It might not bear any actual relationship to that thing. I call my dog a dog, and that's what we've just agreed upon to call it a dog. But whether or not the language that I use to describe it as a dog bears any relationship to its beingness is, we don't know.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you can say that almost everything applies to that.
Mm-hmm.
And you can say the same thing about math, or we could go on endlessly with that right. thought. But the point is that there's this idea that neurosis is really a substitution for the real suffering that's behind it. And there is this incredible value in neurosis if you can just acknowledge what it's really kind of occulting, more or less, what's really at the bottom of it. And that's something that Jung also takes to dream work as well. I don't mean to harp on the dream thing continually, but this idea that, when a dream symbol is produced and given to the conscious mind, the dreaming mind already knows the meaning of the symbol because it chose it. It contains the answer within the riddle already. Mm-hmm. Just as, the answers to any kind of story are already contained within the story.
That's a wonderful point, Nick, because if I take Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, which is pretty much psychology incarnate in a poetic verse format, and I pour it in the same bowl as William Blake's The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, I've got a pretty big core piece of the both and of psychology going on between Nietzsche and William Blake earlier than that. And so I think you're right. The first modern psychologist, really, with the form giver, at least, was Nietzsche. I think, as you said, that's a really, really wonderful point.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think I agree with you, but I think also it's kind of wrapped up, and and then we've all referenced this a lot, and it's the most known thing that Nietzsche said. But the idea of God being dead, and that whole notion, the sense that this metaphysical scaffolding and protective layer is just completely gone now. I mean, that kind of expresses the same idea as well, that maybe religion, in the sense that he was so critical of, really was this safeguard against true suffering, against the true human experience in its absolute care and beauty.
Yes, when I think when he said God is dead, I kind of firmly feel that his meaning was that because we don't need the ecclesiastical institution for God anymore, the God is within. So the God that we know, or I would say, if I put in parentheses, the God, open parentheses, we know, quote, close parentheses, is dead. I think he was making a modern statement for the evolution of consciousness, that it's time that people realize that which we have been following has always been inside us.
Right. And it's not exactly what we've been sold. I want to bring up a couple of things here that are in the YouTube chat. Coleman says, when Jung said he thought he was pulling a schizophrenia, did he believe, or would he have recommended one who is stuck under deep water in the underworld to attempt antipsychotic drugs for help? And what I would say, Coleman, is that the essay in which you found that, and which also refers to these essays, were written, I think, long before antipsychotic drugs were developed in the psychiatric industry. And I don't remember a single time when Jung suggested any sort of drug for a patient. I don't remember a single time. And indeed, he did write something about peyote or something like that, and said that you don't need that. And
does that happen to be Coleman Barks, the Rumi scholar?
This is Coleman Remington, and I don't know if that's a genuine name or not. But anyway, so the answer is that Jung would not have been recommending a psychotic drug, and I wouldn't go looking for a psychotic drug outside of work with an actual licensed psychiatrist. That's what I would say. And then he says, I think the shadow has positive qualities that come from confrontation, but if it wasn't this dark aspect, it would not be defined in the category our brains are trying to create with shadow. And the shadow definitely has positive characteristics. And by shadow, we're talking about things which are not in consciousness. Okay. And so it includes both horrible instincts, ideas that are not appropriate for the real world. And it includes ideas like, wow, I like that young woman over there, maybe I'll marry her, type thing. That's in the shadow too. But all of a sudden you see the woman you're going to marry, and there she is, and that's coming out of the shadow. That wasn't in your conscious mind until the moment you had this, moment between the two of you. And so, certainly not everything in the shadow is negative, and
I think that the light is founded in the shadow. the shadow support. It's a figure ground relationship, the unknown and the known. And if I look at capital S self and I'm only given 2 words on a desert island to define it, I just say phonic numinosity. This is the deep, dark depths of the lights together. And so the shadow, I think people do a lot of shadow work, they say, but they're really talking about neuroses and negative behaviors and fears and inhibitions and addictions. The shadow is more, towards, leaning over, jumping into Red Rover. Let me, Jordan, jump over to Nick's court. It's in dreamland, it's the unconscious, and it's got a voice. And I think it comes through dreams, or active imagination, or creativity. Even inducing the creative wellspring in an artistic process, there's shadow.
I have to interrupt here because Raquel Fonseca has appeared on the YouTube chat.
Yay!
And Raquel, we're glad to hear from you. We've been wondering how you are for a very long time. So please give us an update by email.
And I have to say, Raquel, I love the new hair color. Since I did finally find you on Instagram, which made me very relieved.
Right. And so she says, I have a semi-question. Can neurosis be an act of refusal of suffering? Because if God is dead, then nothing can save us. But even so, I refuse to suffer, therefore create a neurosis. And she says she's crawling out of her hole. But anyway, we've been missing you, Raquel and I, and we hope to hear from you in terms, privately, not necessarily on YouTube chat.
Good for you doing what you needed to do.
Yeah.
Can I make a couple of comments here really quickly?
Yeah, please do.
So I made a comment in the YouTube chat, but I think we would do well to just say this here also. In regards to Justin's question about is the shadow only negative aspects of ourselves, I commented and said that the shadow is only what we've disallowed, and the process of having an ego or being an ego or having the conscious experience of myself consists in me saying I am this, thus I am not that. So as I said in the YouTube chat, right, I am nice. I think I'm a nice person. So that means I'm not mean. So that means I've disallowed meanness or whatever that oppositional.
I would never want to get in front of you when you snap back to the other way.
I'm just making an arbitrary example. Of course, I don't think I'm a saint by any means, but I'm just trying to say that, the ego is not necessarily, the shadow, is not necessarily all negative. There are obviously situations in which, being assertive or being forceful or being what seems externally like meanness is called for, and that you need to have a right relationship to that as well. That's something that needs to be there, even if only in potential. But, very few people would self-report like, I know I'm a nice person, but I also know I can be downright mean. It's pretty rare that you have both of those things in conscious awareness. So more often than not, one side or the other of oppositional traits are then split off into the shadow. So of course, no, it's not all negative.
And also I think to speak to that directly, and this may sound initially, there's going to be a deceptive simplicity probably in this statement, but think about the nuance. If I take it literally and say, the shadow is cast by my light, then what happens is in that shadow is all potentiality, that unknown from which all else emanates. So to even speak to Raquel's question about the suffering piece, I think it matters not whether there is a divine presence, defined, existent or not. If we experience that, we do. And so regardless of the reason, I think there's that potentiality piece in the shadow that is cast. There's a nothingness there, but it's in a sense, it's also an open cave, dark door for, making besties with beasties or whatever to come out, or for Plato to come out of the cave. there's a lot of things there that literally, if something doesn't cast a shadow, that's when, to me, it's unreal. That would be odd. The whole vampire thing of not casting a reflection, there's a lack of existence in a way there of life.
Yeah, I'll tell another story of Cliff Smith, by the way, who was an interesting fellow because he was a very logos rationality, quant type of business school professor, but he was married to a psychologist, and he had me persuaded at that time, back when I was 32, that there was nothing to psychology and you could explain everything rationally, right? And you should think of it that way, right? And so for a long time I thought that, but here I am for the last 30 years drawn to psychology, which came out of my unconscious, came out of my shadow, and has been valuable to me. And so, psychology is meaningful to me. And, his dicta during business school was just wrong. And interestingly, when the crash came in 2008, I was in a big meeting where Cliff was on the panel on a dais, and I said, Cliff, we had this huge crash, but I don't remember any of you ever talking about the possibility of this. And he said, oh, well, it's just a black swan event. So he blew it off that way. And okay, that's the way statisticians explained what happened in 2008. But the idea was that black swans don't exist. And then I was a couple of years later in 2010, I was in Hawaii, and I actually saw a flock of black swans. I immediately took photographs and sent them to the dean of the business school and said, yes, they do exist. And, you need to be teaching about it.
With Cliff being such a overly rationalist, I wonder if he was taking out his arguments that he couldn't win with his psychologist wife on you.
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. Okay. Let's see.
They're in a 72 here.
Okay, you want to read it?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, everybody bear with me. This is a two.
This is a 2-pager. Yeah.
2-pager.
Yeah. Okay. We may allow that this view has a certain justification insofar as man is at all capable of marking out a definite line along which his life has to go. But we know that there is no human foresight or wisdom that can prescribe direction to our life except for small stretches of the way. This is, of course, true only of the ordinary type of life, not of the heroic type. The latter kind also exists, though it is much rarer. Here we are certainly not entitled to say that no marked direction can be given to life, or only for short distances. The heroic style of life is absolute. That is, it is oriented by fateful decisions, and the decision to go in a certain direction holds sometimes to the bitter end. Admittedly, the doctor has to do, in the main, only with human beings, seldom with voluntary heroes, and then they are mostly of a type whose surface heroism is an infantile defiance of a fate greater than they, or else a pomposity meant to cover up some touchy inferiority. In this overpoweringly humdrum existence, alas, there is little out of the ordinary that is healthy, and not much room for conspicuous heroism. Not that heroic demands are never put to us. On the contrary, and this is just what is so irritating and irksome, the banal every day makes banal demands upon our patience, our devotion, perseverance, self-sacrifice. And for us to fulfill these demands, as we must, humbly, and without courting applause through heroic gestures, a heroism is needed that cannot be seen from the outside. It does not glitter, is not belauded, and it always seeks concealment in everyday attire. These are the demands which, if not fulfilled, are the cause of neurosis. In order to evade them, many a man has dared the great decision of his life and carried it through, even if in the common human estimation it was a great error. Before a fate such as this one can only, hold on one second, sorry. Before a fate such as this one can only bow one's head. But as I say, such cases are rare. The others are in the vast majority. For them, the direction of their life is not a simple straight line. Fate confronts them like an intricate labyrinth, all too rich in possibilities, and yet of these many possibilities, only one is their own right way. Who would presume, even though armed with the completest knowledge of his own character, to designate in advance that single possibility? Much indeed can be attained by the will, but in view of the fate certain markedly strong-willed personalities, it is a fundamental error to try to subject our own fate at all costs to our will. Our will is a function regulated by reflection. Hence, it is dependent on the quality of that reflection. This, if it really is reflection, is supposed to be rational, i.e., in accord with reason. But has it ever been shown, or will it ever be, that life and fate are in accord with reason, that they too are rational? We have, on the contrary, good grounds for supposing that they are irrational, or rather, that in the last resort they are grounded beyond human reason. The irrationality of events is shown in what we call chance, which we are obviously compelled to deny because we cannot, in principle, think of any process that is not causal and necessary, whence it follows that it cannot happen by chance. And he refers to a footnote here which says, modern physics has put an end to this strict causality. Now there is only, quote, statistical probability. As far back as 1916, I had pointed out the limitations of the causal view in psychology, for which I was heavily censored at the time. See my preface to the second edition of Collected Papers on Analytical Psychology and Freud and Psychoanalysis. Okay, back to the paragraph. In practice, however, chance reigns everywhere, and so obtrusively that we might as well put our causal philosophy in our pocket. The plenitude of life is governed by law and yet not governed by law, rational and yet irrational. Hence reason and the will that is grounded in reason are valid only up to a point. The further we go in the direction selected by reason, sure we may be that we are excluding the irrational possibilities of life, which have just as much right to be lived. It was indeed highly expedient for man to become somewhat more capable of directing his life. It may justly be maintained that the acquisition of reason is the greatest achievement of humanity, but that is not to say that things must or will always continue in that direction. The frightful catastrophe of the First World War drew a very thick line through the calculations of even the most optimistic rationalizers of culture. In 1913, Wilhelm Ostwald wrote, "The whole world is agreed that the present state of armed peace is untenable and is gradually becoming impossible. It demands tremendous sacrifices from each single nation, far exceeding the expenditure for cultural purposes, yet without securing any positive values. If mankind could discover ways and means for doing away with these preparations for wars which never take place, together with the immobilization of a large part of the nation's manhood, at the age of maximum strength and efficiency, for the furtherance of warlike aims and all the other innumerable evils which the present state of affairs creates, such an immense economy of energy would be effected that from this moment onwards we could look forward to a blossoming of culture hitherto undreamed of. For war, like personal combat, all the oldest of all possible means of setting contests of will, is on that very account the most inept and entails the most grievous waste of energy. Hence the complete abolition of warfare, potential no less than actual, is the categorical imperative of efficiency and one of the supremely important cultural tasks of our day." What a mouthful.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I would actually add to footnote 4 his Jung's book Synchronicity and a Causal Connecting Principle. It's a really short one, maybe a 1/4 inch thick, but that goes from instead of the causative, and instead of saying reasons are unreasonable, he dials into synchronicity instead as his method of expression.
Yeah, and in conjunction with this, I've been doing a lot of reading and Seven Pillars of Wisdom this week because I'm going to give the book to my 18-year-old grandson on his birthday. It's very interesting to observe what happened to T.E. Lawrence during this 2-year period when he was, quote unquote, Lawrence of Arabia, because he was a really unassuming man. He may have been gay, and he was asked to just basically do a recon analysis of what the Arabs could do, and fate just drew him in to a situation where he became the leader of a major part of the British campaign against the Ottoman Empire. And when that was over, he begged to be released. He never wanted to do any of that. And he got out of the military, and he wrote his book. He advised Churchill and others about the Middle East. But then he tried to disappear. He was appointed a colonel in the British Army, but he tried to enlist in the Air Force. He ultimately did enlist in the Air Force as an enlisted man. He wanted to just disappear so that people, and probably he did have a bounty on his head, I guess. So it wasn't a bad idea, I suppose, for him to get assigned to Karachi, Pakistan, as a trooper in the Air Force. But and he was a young man at that time. But there can be no doubt. There's no doubt in my mind that he was the most effective serving officer of World War I, and a genuine hero. And he pulled together, 30 competing tribes that were at each other's throats for thousands of years over wells, and got them all to fight in one direction for a 2-year period. And at the end, the surface tension of that went away, and so did he. But I mean, the 100 years later, we have the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which is the result of what he did. And in the end, it's probably a good thing in terms of holding the Middle East together in some way. You can get called into a heroic situation where you actually rise to this heroic moment, but then ultimately you can withdraw from that too, and which he did, and sadly his life ended in 1935 with on a motorcycle accident. But but he did do one great heroic thing for a 2-year period, and it's pretty hard to live up to that heroism for all the time, right? You can't do that all the time.
Yeah, I'm really thankful for Jung kind of pointing a finger at the idea that I don't know if I quite agree with the language that he's using here in the sense of trying to divide rational and irrational, but I am thankful for the notion of fate and chance and kind of extenuating circumstances. But honestly, I mean, to me, I could easily go into a debate on this for a long while, but it honestly almost seems to me like a rational move to acknowledge irrationality.
Yep.
Certainly. And
That's why I like
uh,
the acausal piece when he finally got to synchronicity,
Right.
because that was later. But you're absolutely on the money, where you're calling his bluff of basically saying the opposite with the same philosophy. It's like,
yeah, and
Yeah, and I
it
appreciate
was pure synchronicity. What that Lawrence rose to that occasion. You know, would somebody else have done it? Probably not, or maybe not. You know, there were British officers with Faisal already, and you know, he was just, by synchronicity, he had the right skill set. And
well, you're right to say too that the repeat performance is what is usually the downfall of post-heroic activity, because it's an adrenaline sport. I mean,
yeah,
you know, I could say in my case, you know, I almost died on a mountain. Well, it stopped me from climbing. I didn't try to repeat the I almost died experience. But, you know, but that's a little rational. That's a little smart. But up to that point, though, I look at what led to that, and it was a cascading, almost geometrical, more and more and more difficult, where you actually will be able to become bored with intensity, and not as a numbness. You kind of just outclass yourself. And that's, I think, when you get out of your depth. And so on the motorcycle accident, it almost no surprise. I don't know the exact extenuating circumstances, but you know, a motorcycle is a pretty intense thing. At high speeds, you don't get to make mistakes. And you know, you're going 185, and well,
especially in 1935.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, that's my example of a heroism because of synchronicity and so on. And he just happened to be the person with the right stuff at the right moment at that time.
Well, I think even astrology, there's an asteroid called Gauss, almost like Gaussian, Gauss, but his other name is Scheherazade, which is 1001 Arabian Nights, you know, which goes right back to him.
I think I've told you guys this before, but my middle school history teacher, super old gentleman, super dry, had been at the school forever. He's like an old Freemason. I never understood this, but he always called me Lawrence of Arabia. And I was like, why the heck is he calling me this?
For your last name. Yeah, he timed it off. That's beautiful.
Have you read the 7 Pillars of Wisdom?
No, I've heard you talk about it. I've listened to some of the talks that you've done on your channel about it, but I haven't read it myself.
Well, let's cover this last paragraph 73 before we hang up here, which is: the irrationality of fate, however, did not concur with the rationality of well-meaning thinkers. It ordained not only the destruction of the accumulated arms and armies, but far beyond that, a mad and monstrous devastation, a mass murder without parallel, from which humanity may possibly draw the conclusion that only one side of fate can be mastered with rational intentions. And I guess what I would say is that Generals Murray and Allenby, who were the generals in charge in Cairo, but there was no form of rationality that would make it possible for them to select a serving officer at that time who could do what he did. Right. Okay. In other words, there was no rational way of thinking about it so that it could be done. And Allenby ultimately, you know, recognized the genius of Lawrence during that period and supported it. And as a result, he got basically a regiment on his right flank going north to Damascus to take it away from the Ottomans. But and that was a pretty cheap investment, really. But it was a recognition that this is what needed to be done. It could not have been planned for. No measure of rationality made it available. He recognized he had a good thing going. Allenby recognized he had a good thing going, but and so he adopted it. He accepted it as sort of fate, I guess. And sort of Lawrence did too. I mean, he realized he was in that position, and he was the only one that could do what he was doing.
Well, and I can just imagine his personal acumen for nuance to be able to have such a probably dignity and difference in a conversation to get 30 tribes. I mean, you're dealing with a millennia you're dealing with a modification of a millennia. That's like
way more than that. 5,000 years.
5,000 years. I mean, it's like, that's the one thing they're good at, fighting. They've always done it. If we go over there, well, we're just somebody else. They've been doing this forever. What is it? Pakistan is the cemetery or graveyard of empires. It's like, so I'd love to be able to fly on the wall and listen to just not only his tone and demeanor, but how he ran a conversation, how he utilized everyone in the room to put them all into a bowl, basically, and mix them up, but where they didn't lose their dignity and all the difference, because he had to be just a masterful communicator.
Yeah, well, I do urge upon everyone, there is a remix of the movie Lawrence of Arabia. It's 3.5 hours long. It's a director's cut, and you can now download it. I have it on my iPhone, and I often go back to it and watch passages of it to see, because there's certain things that always happen, and that I finally recognized it as what I had done, and I hadn't understood that before. In other words, okay, I read it the first time about 30 years ago, and I said, wow, I lived this, but I didn't think more about it at that time. But when I came back to it 30 years later and reread it to talk to Tim about it, I realized that those characteristics that Lawrence pulled up were exactly what you need to be a leader in any organization.
Right.
And basically he went into a situation where he was an outsider. He had to prove himself. He had to gain their trust. He had to have enough hardness to be the leader, and then he had to go back to his own bosses and say, look what I've done. Do you want more of this? Right.
I succeeded. Would you like me to continue that?
Right. But basically, that's exactly what has happened to me in my business career, and it's happening again in two other areas, one in the Confluence and one in my business in Kuala Lumpur. And so that book and that movie are just filled with so much wisdom for someone who wants to be a leader. These are the things that you have to do, not in battle necessarily, but right. Because I don't claim that I did any of my stuff in battle. I was in battle, but I was deathly afraid during that period of time. I was not a heroic leader when I was in Vietnam. I just did what I had to do to stay alive every day. But later on, I basically went through the whole series of things that Lawrence goes through, including, finding a traitor in my midst. And, there's always a traitor, and you always have to deal with that traitor, and what do you do about it? sometimes you have to let that person cook for a while, and then you have to put an end to it.
Well, and that's the thing about learning about betrayal firsthand. You realize your enemies will never betray you. They can't. They already don't like you.
Yeah.
The betrayal always comes from within. Just by definition, your enemy can't betray you because they already don't trust you. I mean,
Yeah.
So it's interesting that the betrayal always comes as a surprise, but it also always comes from within.
Yep. And so those lessons are, presented loudly in that movie, of course, because it's a movie about warfare. But, nonetheless, there's a reason he called the book 7 Pillars of Wisdom, because he got a lot of wisdom out of that 2-year period when he was at Wadi Rum and doing the things he had to do to make that happen. And so anyway, and he did it naturally, not based on any psychological theory or anything like that. Psychological theory would have been worthless to him at that
Probably
time.
got in his way of demeaning the nuance of how masterful he probably was with how many psychologies. I mean, 30 cultures, 30 tribes.
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
30 cultures. That's not 30 people. I mean, that's 30 cultures, which is a whole different ball of wax.
Absolutely. And he did have the right stuff. I mean, at the beginning of it, when he was selected for the mission to Faisal, he already spoke Arabic. He had spent 4 years in a dig in Turkey, and so he knew how to handle people in an archaeological dig, and that requires leadership too. So he did know the Arab mind a bit when he went into it, but nobody could have predicted what came out of it, which was, as I say, as I look at it again and again, I find that he was the most effective serving officer. I mean, there may have been others who were heroic and earned the Medal of Honor and what have you, but in terms of getting something done from nothing, wow.
And across 2 years, this wasn't a flash in the pan. That requires beyond a discipline of the ritual.
Right. And the movie doesn't really cover it enough. I mean, it sort of gives highlights of what he was doing, but you have to really read the book to appreciate the depth and the struggle that he was in. And the movie sort of highlights the heroic things, but anyway, I will release you. Beth, do you want to make any comment here on this evening?
Thank you. I've enjoyed reading with you all. Thank you.
Good. Marilyn, do you have anything? We can't hear you, Marilyn.
This is really wonderful. Very, very, I'm just thinking back to the comment before, and I'm sorry if we're so old. I can't help it. That's who we are. And if people don't like it, it will happen to them. If they're lucky enough to live a long life, they will get old as well.
Right.
So,
Right.
And I welcome it. I am grateful for every day.
Oh, wait, Nick, I guess I can't give it to you, but I just found a Jungian depth psychology singles group.
No, Nick is taken.
But you don't swipe. You have to swipe up or down because it's as above, so below. It's
so funny. The majority of my friends are all, significantly older than I am, and it doesn't bother me at all. I feel I'm among people that I can converse freely with. So think nothing of that comment, as I certainly do not.
Nice.
Well, I appreciate that, Nick. And I recognized long ago that you were an old soul, and so you're.
You've been telling me that my entire life, and I don't know what it means. I don't know.
Well, I sort of know what it means from personal experience because the same thing happened to me. My mother said that I was 40 years old the day I was born.
Yes. Yeah, getting called the little wise man, when you're.
Yeah. So anyway, okay.
It's a common issue, Nick.
Good
When I was
night,
27,
everyone.
most of my friends were 54. So good night, everybody.
Yeah, Neil says here on the chat, fate makes you a hero or dead. Yeah.
Yes.
And that's basically the way it was in World War I, certainly. Good
Pretty
night,
much.
Marilyn.
Good night.
Take care.
Good night's good.
Good night. Ah, goodness gracious. Let's just see. And Raquel, please, send us an email. Tell us how you